Arthur Langley was not your ordinary 78-year-old man. He lived in a quiet little town surrounded by fields of corn and wildflowers, where life moved at its own slow pace. Every morning, Arthur would wake up early, sip his coffee on the porch, and watch the sun rise over the horizon. To most people in the town, he was just Mr. Langley, the kind elderly man who always had a smile for everyone. But few knew about the extraordinary life Arthur had led before retiring to this peaceful corner of the world. Decades earlier, Arthur had been one of the brightest minds in the airline industry. As a young man fresh out of college, he started working as a junior executive at a small regional airline. His sharp business sense combined with his ability to connect with people quickly propelled him up the ranks. By the time he was in his 40s, Arthur had become a key figure in shaping some of the largest airlines in the country. He wasn't just good at numbers, he cared deeply about passengers' experiences. Under his leadership, several struggling airlines turned into thriving businesses. Yet despite all his success, Arthur never let fame or fortune change him. When he retired, he left behind boardrooms and private jets to live a simple life filled with gardening, reading, and mentoring young entrepreneurs. On this particular day, however, Arthur's calm routine was interrupted by something unusual. His granddaughter Emily was graduating from college, a milestone he didn't want to miss for anything in the world. So after packing his suitcase carefully, he always packed light, Arthur drove himself to the airport. The flight ahead promised to be long but uneventful, just like any other journey. Little did he know that this trip would become one of the most unforgettable days of his life. At the airport, everything seemed normal at first. Arthur checked in without any trouble, handed over his luggage, and made his way through security. He walked slowly but steadily, leaning slightly on his cane. People occasionally smiled at him, perhaps noticing how neatly dressed he was. His suit jacket pressed, tie perfectly knotted, and shoes polished to a shine. Arthur took pride in looking presentable, even when traveling. After all, he believed, that respect went both ways. You gave it and you received it. But things changed abruptly once he reached the security checkpoint. As Arthur placed his carry-on bag on the conveyor belt, the machine beeped loudly. A young officer motioned for him to step aside while another began rummaging through his belongings. It didn't take long for them to find the source of the problem. An antique pocket knife tucked inside a side compartment of his bag. The knife, no bigger than a large coin, had been passed down through generations in Arthur's family. It was more than just a tool. It was a cherished heirloom, a reminder of his grandfather who had used it during his days as a farmer. When the officer held up the knife, Arthur immediately tried to explain. "It's harmless," he said gently, his voice steady despite the growing tension around him. "It's an old family keepsake. I forgot it was in there." But the officer shook his head firmly. Rules were rules, and carrying anything resembling a weapon onto a plane, even unintentionally, was strictly prohibited. Arthur nodded, understanding the policy. He apologized sincerely and offered to surrender the item right then and there. Surely, they could see he meant no harm. Unfortunately, the situation escalated faster than Arthur anticipated. Another officer arrived, this one less patient than the first. Without much discussion, they decided that Arthur needed to be removed from the flight altogether. For safety reasons, they told him curtly. Despite his protests, Arthur found himself being escorted away from the gate. Passengers waiting nearby craned their necks to see what was happening. Some looked sympathetic, while others snickered quietly, amused by the spectacle of an elderly man being led away like a troublemaker. The humiliation stung more than Arthur expected. He wasn't angry so much as disappointed, not only in the officer's lack of empathy, but also in the system itself. Here he was, a man who had spent decades ensuring safe and comfortable travel for millions of passengers, now being treated as though he posed a threat. What hurt the most, though, was the casual disregard for his dignity. One of the officers muttered under their breath, loud enough for Arthur to hear, "Old folks like him should know better." Those words lingered in Arthur's mind as he sat alone in a quiet corner of the terminal later that afternoon. His flight had already departed without him, leaving him stranded hundreds of miles away from his destination. While waiting for his daughter to pick him up, Arthur replayed the incident in his head. He thought about the countless hours he'd spent training airline staff to prioritize customer service, to treat every passenger with respect regardless of age, race, or background. And yet here he was, a victim of the very behaviors he'd worked so hard to eliminate. Still, Arthur wasn't one to dwell on negativity for too long. As the initial shock wore off, a spark of determination ignited within him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message. If a man of his stature, a former industry leader, could be treated this way, what hope did ordinary travelers have? Sitting there, clutching his cane, Arthur began formulating a plan. He may have retired from the corporate world, but he still had connections and influence that could shake things up in ways no one anticipated. Little did anyone know, this seemingly minor incident would soon spiral into something far bigger than anyone could imagine. For Arthur Langley, the real journey was just beginning. After the unsettling events at the airport, Arthur returned home with a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Humiliation, frustration, and disbelief all vied for space in his mind. But what stood out most was the gnawing sense of injustice, not just for himself, but for everyone who might have faced similar treatment. As he settled into his favorite armchair by the window, Arthur replayed every detail of the incident in his head. The cold stares from the security officers, the dismissive tone of their voices, and the way some passengers had laughed softly as he was led away. It all felt like a sharp slap to his dignity. His daughter, Sarah, arrived later that evening after hearing about what happened. She found her father sitting quietly, staring out the window as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Dad," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Arthur nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "It's not just about me, Sarah," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "This is about how people are treated, how they're made to feel small when they've done nothing wrong." Sarah listened intently as Arthur recounted the entire ordeal. When he mentioned the officer's muttered comment about old folks, her face flushed with anger. "That's unacceptable," she exclaimed. "You should file a complaint with the airline. They can't treat people like that." Arthur smiled faintly. Filing a complaint was certainly an option, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Complaints were easy to ignore, especially for a massive corporation like Skyline Airlines. No, if he wanted to make a real impact, he needed to think bigger. As the night wore on, Arthur retreated to his study, a cozy room lined with shelves filled with books and framed photographs from his career. Among those frames was one picture that always caught his eye. A group photo taken during his tenure as CEO of Horizon Airways. In it, he stood alongside his team, beaming with pride after successfully turning around a struggling airline. Those days seemed so far away now, yet the lessons he'd learned remained fresh in his mind. One lesson in particular echoed loudly tonight. Power, when used wisely, could bring about meaningful change. Arthur sat at his desk, gazing at the antique pocket knife lying in front of him. It was ironic, really. This tiny object, meant to symbolize family heritage and resilience, had become the catalyst for something much larger. Picking up the phone, he dialed a number he hadn't called in years, the direct line to the current CEO of Skyline Airlines. After a brief pause, a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Arthur?" the CEO said, sounding both surprised and pleased. "Is that you?" "Yes, it's me," Arthur replied, his tone warm but measured. He exchanged pleasantries briefly before getting straight to the point. "I need to talk to you about something serious," he said. The CEO's tone shifted immediately, sensing the gravity in Arthur's words. Over the next few minutes, Arthur recounted his experience at the airport, sparing no detail. He described how he'd been humiliated in front of strangers, how the situation had spiraled unnecessarily, and how it reflected poorly on the airline's values. When he finished speaking, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, the CEO spoke, his voice tinged with concern. "Arthur, I'm truly sorry this happened. We'll look into it right away." But Arthur wasn't done yet. "There's more," he continued, his voice growing firmer. I still hold a significant stake in your company, and unless drastic changes are made to how you treat your customers, I intend to liquidate my shares, every last one of them." The CEO nearly dropped the phone. Arthur's stake in Skyline Airlines was worth billions, and selling it off would send shockwaves through the industry. The very idea of losing such a major investor was unthinkable. "Arthur, please," the CEO stammered, clearly rattled. "Let's discuss this further. There must be a way to resolve this without taking such extreme measures." But Arthur wasn't bluffing. He explained that this wasn't just about revenge or teaching someone a lesson, it was about accountability. "Your airline has forgotten its purpose," he said sternly. "You exist to serve your passengers, not to bully them. If you don't fix this culture, others will suffer the same fate I did, or worse." With that, he ended the call, leaving the CEO scrambling to figure out his next move. Over the following days, Arthur didn't stop there. He reached out to several influential investors he'd worked with over the years, sharing his story and urging them to reconsider their support for Skyline Airlines until substantial reforms were implemented. Word spread quickly among financial circles, and soon enough, whispers of Arthur's threat began making headlines. Journalists caught wind of the story, eager to uncover the truth behind the elderly man who dared to challenge a corporate giant. Meanwhile, Arthur received calls from reporters wanting to interview him. At first he declined, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But as public interest grew, he realized this was an opportunity to amplify his message. Sitting down with a trusted journalist, Arthur shared his side of the story, not to gain sympathy but to highlight the importance of treating every individual with respect. "This isn't about me being rich or powerful," he emphasized. "It's about reminding companies that their customers are human beings, not obstacles to profit." The article hit newsstands the next morning, sparking widespread outrage. Social media erupted with stories from passengers who had endured similar mistreatment at the hands of Skyline Airlines. Some recounted rude staff members, while others described arbitrary rules enforced unfairly. The hashtag #RespectPassengers trended globally, drawing attention not only to Arthur's plight, but also to systemic issues within the aviation industry. Back at Skyline Airlines headquarters, chaos reigned supreme. Stock prices plummeted as investors panicked over the potential fallout from Arthur's actions. Board meetings turned into heated debates about how to salvage the company's reputation. Executives scrambled to draft press releases promising immediate improvements in customer service. Yet none of these efforts seemed sufficient to quell the storm Arthur had unleashed. Through it all, Arthur remained composed. He wasn't driven by malice or a desire for personal gain. His goal was simple: to remind the world that dignity mattered. Every person deserved to be treated with kindness and understanding, regardless of age or status. And if it took pulling $4 billion from an airline to drive that point home, then so be it. As the days passed, Arthur couldn't help but reflect on how quickly things had escalated. What started as a minor inconvenience at the airport had snowballed into a national conversation about corporate responsibility. Though he never sought fame or recognition, Arthur embraced his role as a catalyst for change. Deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of a much larger movement, one that would force industries to rethink their priorities and put humanity back at the forefront. For now, though, Arthur returned to his garden, tending to his plants, with the same care and patience he brought to everything else in life. Change, he reminded himself, took time. But like seeds planted in fertile soil, the seeds of justice and respect would grow, if given the chance. The days following Arthur's phone call were a whirlwind of activity, not just for him but for the entire aviation industry. News of his decision to liquidate $4 billion worth of shares in Skyline Airlines spread like wildfire. Investors, analysts, and journalists scrambled to make sense of what was happening. For many, it seemed almost surreal. An elderly man, once a towering figure in the airline world, had suddenly re-emerged from retirement to challenge one of the biggest corporations in the business. But this wasn't just about money. It was about sending a message that could no longer be ignored. Arthur's daughter, Sarah, watched as her father became the center of attention overnight. Reporters camped outside their home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had dared to take on a corporate giant. Friends and neighbors called non-stop, eager to hear the full story. Despite all the chaos, Arthur remained unfazed. He went about his daily routine as if nothing unusual was happening, watering his garden, reading the newspaper, and occasionally offering a polite smile to the reporters lingering by his driveway. To him, this wasn't about fame or drama. It was about accountability. Behind closed doors, however, Arthur was anything but idle. He spent hours poring over documents, reviewing Skyline Airlines' recent financial reports, customer service records, and employee training manuals. Decades of experience in the industry gave him an insider's perspective on where the company had gone wrong. It wasn't hard to see the cracks in their system: declining passenger satisfaction scores, frequent complaints about rude staff, and policies that prioritized profits over people. These issues weren't unique to Skyline. They plagued much of the aviation industry. But Arthur believed someone needed to draw a line in the sand. And who better than him? One afternoon, while sitting at his desk, Arthur received another call from the CEO of Skyline Airlines. This time, the tone was desperate. "Arthur, we need to meet," the CEO pleaded. "In person, please." Arthur agreed, though he made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a demand for action. They arranged to meet the following week at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in the city, far from prying eyes and flashing cameras. When the day arrived, Arthur dressed impeccably as always. Wearing his favorite navy blue suit and polished leather shoes, he walked into the cafe with the same quiet confidence that had defined his career. The CEO, visibly nervous, greeted him with an awkward handshake. Over coffee, they dove straight into the heart of the matter. The CEO outlined several steps the airline planned to take to address customer complaints, including revamped training programs for employees and stricter enforcement of respectful behavior standards. But Arthur listened intently, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, Arthur leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto the CEO. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't about damage control or public relations stunts. If you want my trust, and the trust of your passengers, you need to prove that these changes are real. Not just words on paper, but actions that will last." He then presented a list of specific demands, each one carefully thought out. First, he insisted on the creation of an independent oversight committee, composed of ordinary passengers who would monitor the airline's practices and report back regularly. Second, he called for a transparent hotline where travelers could report mistreatment without fear of retaliation. Third, he proposed mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, focusing not only on customer service but also on empathy and respect for diversity. Finally, he demanded that Skyline publicly apologize, not just to him but to every passenger who had ever been treated unfairly. The CEO nodded slowly, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of Arthur's requests. "I understand," he said finally. "We'll do everything we can to meet your expectations." But Arthur wasn't satisfied yet. "Good intentions aren't enough," he replied. "You have until the end of the month to show measurable progress. Otherwise, I'll proceed with selling my shares." As the meeting came to a close, Arthur left the cafe feeling a mix of emotions. Part of him felt guilty for putting so much pressure on the airline, knowing it would cause turmoil among employees and shareholders alike. But another part of him felt a deep sense of purpose. If this was what it took to force meaningful change, then so be it. He reminded himself that sometimes discomfort was necessary for growth. Back at home, Arthur continued to work tirelessly behind the scenes. He reached out to influential figures in the aviation industry, sharing his vision for a more compassionate and accountable future. Many were skeptical at first, dismissing his efforts as idealistic or impractical, but others listened, and soon, a coalition began to form. Former colleagues, advocacy groups, and even rival airlines joined forces to support Arthur's mission. Together, they drafted a set of guidelines aimed at improving passenger experiences across the board, not just within Skyline Airlines. Meanwhile, the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. Every move Arthur made was dissected and analyzed, in excruciating detail. Some praised him as a hero, a symbol of resistance against corporate greed. Others criticized him, accusing him of using his wealth and influence to settle a personal grudge. Through it all, Arthur remained steadfast. He granted interviews sparingly, choosing his words carefully to avoid fueling unnecessary controversy. When asked why he was doing this, his answer was always the same: because it's the right thing to do. Public opinion began to shift as well. Passengers shared their own stories of mistreatment on social media, tagging Skyline Airlines, and demanding answers. Protesters gathered outside the company's headquarters holding signs that read, "Respect your customers and justice for Arthur." Celebrities and influencers added their voices to the movement, amplifying its reach. Even lawmakers took notice, calling for hearings to investigate widespread issues within the airline industry. Skyline Airlines, meanwhile, found itself in a precarious position. Stock prices continued to plummet as investors grew increasingly uneasy. Competitors seized the opportunity to lure away dissatisfied customers, launching ad campaigns touting their superior customer service. Internally, tensions ran high as executives debated how best to respond to Arthur's ultimatum. Some argued for doubling down on cost-cutting measures to compensate for potential losses, while others urged a complete overhaul of the company's culture. It was clear that half-hearted attempts wouldn't suffice, not when billions of dollars were on the line. Amidst the chaos, Arthur received a letter from an unexpected source, a young flight attendant named Maria. She wrote to thank him for shining a light on the struggles faced by frontline workers like herself. "We're caught between impossible rules and angry passengers," she explained. "Your voice gives us hope that things might actually change." Her words touched Arthur deeply, reinforcing his belief that this fight was bigger than anyone, person or company. By the end of the month, Skyline Airlines announced a series of sweeping reforms designed to address the concerns Arthur had raised. They unveiled new training programs, established the independent oversight committee he'd requested, and issued a heartfelt apology to passengers affected by past incidents. While some critics dismissed these efforts as too little, too late, others saw them as a promising step in the right direction. For Arthur, the battle was far from over. He knew that true change required vigilance and perseverance, but as he stood in his garden watching the sun dip below the horizon, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This chapter of his life had taken an unexpected turn, but it was one he wouldn't trade for anything. After all, dignity wasn't something you could put a price on, and if his actions inspired others to stand up for what was right, then every sleepless night and stressful day had been worth it. The aftermath of Arthur's bold move sent shockwaves through Skyline Airlines and the aviation industry as a whole. The reforms announced by the airline were just the beginning, but they came at a steep cost. Stock prices continued to tumble, and investors panicked as uncertainty loomed over the company's future. Analysts debated whether Skyline could recover from such a public relations disaster, while passengers weighed their options. Should they continue flying with an airline that had treated its customers so poorly, or switch to competitors who seemed eager to capitalize on the chaos? For Arthur, the fallout was both satisfying and sobering. He had never intended to destroy Skyline Airlines. His goal was to spark change, not collapse. But he also understood that drastic measures were often necessary to wake people up to deeper problems. As he watched the news coverage unfold from the comfort of his living room, he couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and concern. Pride because his actions had ignited a national conversation about respect and accountability. Concern because he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, not just for Skyline, but for everyone involved. At Skyline's headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Executives worked around the clock, scrambling to implement the promised reforms while trying to reassure jittery investors. Board meetings stretched late into the night, filled with heated arguments and conflicting opinions. Some executives argued that focusing too much on customer service would eat into profits, while others insisted it was the only way to regain trust. Meanwhile, employees at every level felt the pressure. Flight attendants and ground staff were suddenly under intense scrutiny, expected to deliver flawless service despite years of inadequate training and support. One particularly telling moment came during a town hall meeting held by Skyline's leadership team. Hundreds of employees gathered in a large conference room, their faces reflecting a mix of fear and frustration. When asked how they planned to address ongoing issues, one executive nervously admitted, "We're learning as we go." The response drew murmurs of disbelief from the crowd. For years, employees had raised concerns about unrealistic expectations and lack of resources, only to be ignored. Now, with Arthur Langley breathing down their necks, the company finally appeared ready to listen. But was it too little, too late? Outside the corporate offices, public sentiment remained divided. Many applauded Arthur's efforts, seeing him as a champion for ordinary travelers. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Croner Respect Passengers and Stand With Arthur, as people shared stories of their own frustrating encounters with airlines. Others, however, questioned whether Arthur's wealth gave him an unfair advantage. Critics accused him of bullying the company, arguing that most passengers wouldn't have the same leverage to demand change. To them, Arthur's story highlighted the growing gap between the powerful elite and everyday consumers. Despite the criticism, Arthur refused to back down. He understood the optics of his position. After all, not everyone had billions of dollars to wield as leverage, but he believed his actions served a greater purpose. "This isn't about me," he told a reporter during a rare interview. "It's about showing that no matter who you are, your voice matters. If I can inspire even one person to stand up for themselves, then this will have been worth it." As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of Arthur's intervention became impossible to ignore. Competing airlines began rolling out their own initiatives aimed at improving customer experiences, hoping to avoid similar backlash. Delta introduced a new policy allowing passengers to provide anonymous feedback after flights. United launched a campaign promoting kindness among staff, complete with heartfelt videos featuring employees sharing personal stories. Even smaller regional carriers jumped on board, realizing that reputation was everything in an era where social media could amplify dissatisfaction instantly. Skyline Airlines, meanwhile, faced mounting challenges. Passengers reported mixed results with the new policies. Some praised the improved attitude of flight attendants and gate agents, crediting the changes to Arthur's influence. Others, however, claimed the reforms were superficial, pointing to continued delays, lost luggage, and unhelpful customer service representatives. It quickly became clear that meaningful transformation required more than just surface-level fixes. It demanded a fundamental shift in mindset. Behind the scenes, Arthur continued to monitor Skyline's progress closely. He attended follow-up meetings with the CEO and reviewed reports from the independent oversight committee he'd helped establish. While there were signs of improvement, he remained cautious. Change doesn't happen overnight, he reminded himself. But if we stop pushing, nothing will ever get better. His determination inspired others to join the cause. A group of retired airline executives reached out to Arthur, offering their expertise to guide Skyline through its transition. Together, they formed a task force dedicated to addressing systemic issues within the industry. Their first project? Overhauling. Employee training programs to emphasize empathy and problem-solving skills. They also advocated for fairer working conditions, recognizing that happy employees were more likely to treat passengers well. Publicly, Arthur used his platform to keep the conversation alive. He wrote op-eds for major newspapers, urging readers to hold companies accountable for their actions. He spoke at conferences and community events, sharing lessons learned from his decades in the industry. And he encouraged passengers to speak up whenever they encountered mistreatment, reminding them that collective voices carried power. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome of Arthur's crusade was the bond it forged between him and frontline workers. Flight attendants, pilots, baggage handlers, and gate agents wrote letters thanking him for shining a spotlight on their struggles. One mechanic named James sent Arthur a heartfelt note saying, "You've given us hope that things might actually improve. Thank you for standing up for all of us. These messages touched Arthur deeply, reinforcing his belief that true change started with listening to those on the ground. By the end of the year, Skyline Airlines began to stabilize. Stock prices slowly rebounded as investors regained confidence in the company's direction. Passenger satisfaction scores ticked upward, though they still lagged behind competitors. More importantly, a cultural shift was underway. Employees reported feeling more empowered to advocate for passengers, knowing their efforts were valued. Customers noticed the difference too, praising the airline for its renewed focus on care and compassion. For Arthur, the journey wasn't without sacrifices. His peaceful retirement had been interrupted by endless phone calls, meetings, and interviews. Yet, he didn't regret a single moment. In fact, he found a renewed sense of purpose in fighting for something bigger than himself. As he stood in his garden one crisp autumn morning, watching leaves swirl in the breeze, he reflected on how far they'd come and how much farther there was to go. "This is just the beginning," he murmured to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. Change was hard, messy, and often painful, but it was also possible. And as long as there were people willing to fight for dignity and respect, the world would keep moving forward, one step at a time. As the months rolled by, the impact of Arthur Langley's actions continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what he or anyone else could have anticipated. Skyline Airlines had made significant strides in reforming its practices, but the real transformation was happening on a much broader scale. The airline industry as a whole was undergoing a reckoning, forced to confront long-standing issues that had been ignored for far too long. And at the center of it all stood Arthur, an unlikely hero whose quiet determination had sparked a movement. Skyline's leadership team worked tirelessly to implement the reforms Arthur had demanded. They introduced new training programs designed not only to teach employees technical skills but also to foster empathy and understanding. Role-playing exercises became a staple of these sessions, encouraging staff to put themselves in passengers' shoes. For instance, flight attendants practiced handling difficult situations, like calming an upset traveler or assisting someone with special needs, with patience and compassion. Gate agents learned conflict resolution techniques to de-escalate tense moments before they spiraled out of control. To ensure accountability, the independent oversight committee Arthur had proposed began conducting regular audits. Composed of ordinary passengers, retired industry professionals, and advocacy group representatives, the committee reviewed customer feedback, investigated complaints, and provided detailed reports to Skyline's executives. Their findings were shared publicly, creating transparency that few airlines had ever dared to embrace. This openness earned cautious praise from critics, though many remained skeptical about whether the changes would last. One of the most impactful initiatives came in the form of the passenger hotline Arthur had insisted on. Unlike previous systems, where complaints often disappeared into a black hole of bureaucracy, this hotline guaranteed a response within 24 hours. Staffed by dedicated representatives trained to listen without judgment, the hotline quickly became a lifeline for frustrated travelers. Stories poured in of passengers who had finally been heard after years of feeling dismissed. One woman recounted how she'd struggled for months to resolve a billing error. After calling the hotline, the issue was fixed within hours. Another man described how a kind operator helped him navigate a medical emergency during a layover. These small victories added up, rebuilding trust one interaction at a time. While Skyline focused on internal improvements, competitors scrambled to keep pace. Delta, United, and other major carriers launched campaigns promoting their own efforts to enhance customer service. Some even adopted policies inspired by Arthur's recommendations, such as empowering employees to make decisions that prioritized passenger well-being over rigid rules. The phrase, "the Arthur effect," entered the lexicon, used to describe any initiative aimed at improving the travel experience. Even airports began rethinking their operations, investing in more comfortable seating areas, clearer signage, and faster security checkpoints. But perhaps the most profound change occurred among frontline workers. For years, many had felt trapped, in thankless jobs with little room for growth or recognition. Now, thanks in part to Arthur's advocacy, they found themselves valued as essential contributors to the industry's success. Flight attendants reported feeling more respected by both passengers and supervisors. Ground crew members appreciated having access to better tools and resources to do their jobs effectively. Pilots expressed gratitude for renewed emphasis on work-life balance, allowing them to spend more time with their families. This shift in workplace culture didn't happen overnight, nor did it come without challenges. Resistance lingered in some corners, particularly among executives reluctant to deviate from traditional profit-driven models. But the tide was turning, and Arthur played a pivotal role in keeping momentum alive. He attended conferences, gave speeches, and met with leaders across various industries to share his vision for a more humane approach to business. His message resonated deeply. Companies thrived when they treated people, not just customers, but employees and communities, as partners rather than obstacles. Arthur's influence extended beyond aviation as well. Retail chains, healthcare providers, and tech companies took notice of his methods, adopting similar strategies to improve customer relations and employee morale. A major grocery store chain implemented a customer-first policy modeled after Skyline's reforms, while a hospital network introduced a hotline for patients to voice concerns directly to administrators. Each success story reinforced Arthur's belief that dignity and respect should be non-negotiable values in every sector. Despite the progress, Arthur refused to rest on his laurels. He knew that maintaining change required constant vigilance. To that end, he partnered with advocacy groups to create educational materials for consumers, teaching them how to advocate for themselves when faced with unfair treatment. He also collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at holding corporations accountable for unethical behavior. Though navigating the political landscape proved challenging, Arthur's persistence paid off when several states passed bills strengthening consumer protection laws. Throughout this whirlwind of activity, Arthur remained grounded in his simple life back home. He tended to his garden, read voraciously, and spent quality time with his family. Yet he couldn't escape the fact that his name had become synonymous with justice and integrity. Strangers approached him in public places, thanking him for standing up to corporate giants. Friends teased him about becoming a celebrity, though Arthur brushed off the attention with characteristic humility. "It's not about me," he'd say with a smile. "It's about reminding people that we're all human beings deserving of kindness." Even so, the weight of responsibility sometimes weighed heavily on him. Late at night, as he sat alone in his study, Arthur reflected on the countless lives affected by his actions. He thought about the flight attendant struggling to support her children, the elderly couple stranded at an airport due to a canceled flight, the young traveler afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. These faces haunted him, not because they represented failures, but because they underscored the importance of continuing the fight. One evening, as autumn leaves swirled outside his window, Arthur received a letter that brought tears to his eyes. It was from a teenage girl named Lily, whose dream of becoming a pilot had nearly been crushed by discouraging remarks from a dismissive instructor. After reading about Arthur's story, she found the courage to pursue her passion anyway. "You taught me that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's brave," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me that I matter." Arthur folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer alongside dozens of others like it. Each one reminded him why he'd embarked on this journey in the first place. By the following spring, Skyline Airlines had stabilized enough for Arthur to step back slightly from his active role in monitoring their progress. The company still faced hurdles, but the foundation for lasting change had been laid. Stock prices rebounded, passenger satisfaction soared, and employees reported higher job satisfaction than ever before. Competitors followed suit, adopting similar reforms to stay competitive. Slowly but surely, the aviation industry transformed into something closer to what Arthur had envisioned decades earlier, a system built on mutual respect and shared humanity. Arthur celebrated these victories quietly, knowing there was still work to be done. At a gala honoring his contributions to the industry, he delivered a speech that encapsulated his philosophy perfectly. Dignity costs nothing, he told the audience, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. But losing it can cost you everything. Let us never forget that behind every ticket number, every boarding pass is a person with hopes, dreams, and a desire to be treated with care. If we can remember that, we'll build a world where everyone feels valued, not just as customers, but as human beings. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Arthur didn't linger in the spotlight. Instead, he slipped away early, eager to return to the peace and simplicity of his garden. As he walked through the rows of blooming flowers, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Change, he realized, wasn't something you achieved once and then moved on from. It was a continuous process, requiring effort, patience, and unwavering commitment. And if his actions had inspired even a fraction of the world to embrace that mindset, then his legacy would endure long after he was gone. As the years passed, Arthur Langley's name became synonymous with dignity, accountability, and the power of standing up for what was right. What had started as a personal ordeal at an airport security checkpoint had grown into a movement that transcended industries and inspired millions. Though he never sought fame or recognition, Arthur embraced his role as a symbol of change, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. By now, Airlines had fully recovered from the chaos of Arthur's intervention. The company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Passenger satisfaction ratings soared to record highs, and employees reported feeling more valued and empowered than ever before. The Independent Oversight Committee continued to operate, ensuring that the reforms remained effective and meaningful. Passengers praised the airline for its transparency and commitment to treating everyone with respect. Competitors followed suit, adopting similar practices to stay competitive in an increasingly customer-focused market. The entire aviation industry had shifted, thanks largely to Arthur's unwavering determination. But Arthur didn't stop there. He used the proceeds from selling half of his shares in Skyline Airlines, amounting to billions of dollars, to fund initiatives aimed at improving lives far beyond the world of air travel. One of his first projects was establishing scholarships for aspiring aviation professionals, particularly those from underrepresented communities. These scholarships covered tuition, books, and living expenses, giving talented young people the opportunity to pursue careers they might otherwise have thought were out of reach. Recipients often wrote heartfelt letters thanking Arthur for believing in them, sharing stories of how his support had changed the trajectory of their lives. Arthur also donated millions to organizations advocating for senior citizens' rights. Having experienced firsthand the indignities faced by older adults in public spaces, he wanted to ensure that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. His contributions helped expand programs providing legal aid, healthcare access, and social services to seniors across the country. He worked closely with these organizations to develop awareness campaigns, highlighting the importance of respecting elders, not just as family members or neighbors, but as vital contributors to society. Age is not a barrier to value, and I would say during interviews. Every stage of life deserves dignity. His advocacy extended to mentoring young entrepreneurs, a passion he'd nurtured since retiring. Arthur opened a community center in his hometown, offering free workshops on leadership, business ethics, and problem-solving. The center quickly became a hub for innovation, attracting aspiring entrepreneurs from all walks of life. Many credited Arthur with helping them turn their ideas into reality, whether it was launching a small startup or developing a product that addressed real-world problems. One participant, a young woman named Mia, went on to create an app connecting elderly individuals with volunteers for companionship and assistance. When asked about her inspiration, she pointed directly to Arthur. "He taught me that success isn't measured by money. It's measured by the impact you have on others," she said. Despite his growing influence, Arthur remained humble and grounded. He continued to live in his modest home, tending to his garden and enjoying quiet moments with his family. Friends and neighbors marveled at how unchanged he seemed despite his newfound prominence. To them, he was still just Mr. Langley, the kind man who always had time for a chat or a cup of coffee. Yet when he spoke publicly, Whether at conferences, community events, or media appearances, his words carried weight. People listened because they trusted him. They knew he wasn't speaking from a place of self-interest, but from genuine care for humanity. One of Arthur's proudest achievements came when a documentary about his life premiered on national television. Titled The Gentle Giant, the film chronicled his journey from a young executive determined to revolutionize air travel to a retired grandfather who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. It featured interviews with passengers whose lives had been touched by his actions, employees who credited him with transforming workplace culture, and industry leaders who admired his vision. The final scene showed Arthur walking through his garden, reflecting on the lessons he hoped others would take away from his story. "Change begins with courage," he said softly. "Courage to speak up, to stand firm, and to believe that things can be better." The documentary resonated deeply with audiences, sparking conversations about accountability, empathy, and the power of individual action. Schools incorporated it into their curriculums, using it as a tool to teach students about leadership and civic responsibility. Community groups organized screenings followed by discussions about how to address systemic issues in their own neighborhoods. For Arthur, seeing his story inspire so many people was both humbling and gratifying. "If even one person decides to fight for what's right because of this," he told a reporter, "then I've done my job." As he entered his 80s, Arthur began thinking more about legacy. Not the kind measured by wealth or accolades, but the kind rooted in lasting impact. He started writing a memoir, pouring his experiences, insights, and advice into its pages. The book, titled Dignity in Action, became an instant bestseller upon release. Readers praised its blend of wisdom, humor, and practical guidance, calling it a roadmap for creating positive change. In the final chapter, Arthur shared a simple yet powerful message. Treat every person as if they are your biggest investor, not because they might be wealthy or influential, but because they are human. Respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. Though his health began to decline slightly with age, Arthur remained active in his causes until the very end. He attended events, gave speeches, and mentored countless individuals, leaving behind a trail of gratitude wherever he went. When he passed away peacefully at the age of 85, tributes poured in from around the world. Former colleagues remembered him as a visionary leader. Passengers thanked him for restoring faith in an industry that had once felt cold and impersonal. Young entrepreneurs credited him with changing the course of their lives. Even competitors acknowledged his contributions, recognizing that his efforts had elevated standards for everyone. In his will, Arthur left instructions for the remaining funds from his Skyline shares to be distributed among the initiatives he cared most about: education, elder advocacy, and community development. He also requested that no statues or monuments be erected in his honor. "My legacy is not in stone," he wrote. "It is in the hearts and actions of those I've inspired to do good." Years later, Arthur's story continued to resonate. Children learned about him in school, discovering how one man's courage had sparked a global movement. Travelers boarded planes knowing their voices mattered, thanks to the systems he helped put in place. Entrepreneurs pursued their dreams with confidence, guided by the principles he instilled. And families gathered around dinner tables, sharing tales of the elderly gentleman who reminded the world that dignity should never be taken for granted. For Arthur Langley, life wasn't about titles, trophies, or financial gain. It was about making the world a little kinder, a little fairer, and a lot more humane. Through his actions, he proved that true greatness wasn't about being the loudest or the richest. It was about lifting others up and leaving behind a legacy of compassion and integrity. And though he may have departed this world, his spirit lived on in every act of kindness, every voice raised against injustice, and every moment where someone chose dignity over indifference.